let's start with the differences. I think, John, you touched on it first, the differences between the United States and the Canadian experiences. What are the big differences? What are the similarities? Towela, let's start with you this time.
I think one main difference with the Canadian Black experience and the American Black experience is, oh wow, my prof is going to be so proud. There's Bordeaux, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but he has this theory about social, culture, and economic capital. And all of us have varying amounts of it, but I feel like one prominent difference to me is I feel like the Black American experience is kind of lacking that cultural capital, that cultural connection to the motherland, and that kind of creates a distortion. But honestly, when I really truly think about it, that's the only difference that I can think of. Economically speaking, we're all kind of on different scales, on different levels. Socially speaking, different scales, different levels, but culturally speaking, I feel like Black Canadians in the diaspora are a little bit more connected to the motherland than Americans. But that's really all I've got, Justin. And and I would love to hear any of your inputs on that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some others, but that's true because potentially, I don't know if this is correct or not, but Canada has this idea of the multicultural board as opposed to American assimilationism, so that it's more possible to still maintain connections with other cultures and other thoughts as opposed to being indoctrinated into this American society. So I think that's a really good point. Asiyah, to you, please.
Yeah, so I've never lived in any of the Americas. Like I was born and raised in the Bahamas, which I think some people thinks that it's a part of the Americas, but it's not. It's a separate country. But that being said, we do get a lot of influence from American like tourists and things like that with that kind of dichotomy and going back and forth. And I also traveled a lot within the Americas when I was younger. So that's kind of the experience that I'm coming from. And I just wanted to highlight that I don't have like a grounded lived experience solidly within the Americas. But when I think about visually, also I'm drawing from social media, mainstream media, news, things like that. The main differences that I see between America and Canada is a lot to how racism presents itself, and I think how overt or covert certain things are, and I think even that is changing as time passes, in the sense that in America it's very overt. It's very clear that you have your KKK, you have your Nazis, you have people who are just overtly disgusted by certain identities of people's, whether it's race, whether it's religion, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality. They are overtly and proudly about it. And so that's one of the differences. And so when you come to a place such as Canada, it seems fluffy. I remember I was an international student when I came here. So I moved here at the beginning of 2015. And it wasn't until 2 years ago that my Canadian bubble popped, so say. And I experienced something that genuinely just shifted my mind. It just completely opened my eyes to, this is a country just like anyone else, and therefore this is a country that holds racism and holds discrimination just like anywhere else. However, Canada's a lot more nuanced in the way that it presents, and therefore it's a lot more microaggressions. It's a lot more statements that seem polite, that seem okay, but leave you walking away with, that was kind of uncomfortable and I'm not sure why. And it leaves you processing, and not until a few days later do you feel, oh, that's why. That was a racist comment. That was a discriminatory comment. That was hatred manifesting itself in a conversation, but it wasn't as overt as what you see. It wasn't as plain, and it wasn't physical violence either. And I think a few of you touched on this, and I think, John, you touched on this as well, in the terms of kind of Canadian culture and that sorry culture. And so I think that inhibits us from having certain conversations. I think when it comes to Canadian culture, you do something, you say sorry, you move on. And there's no space sometimes for that conversation, that uncomfortability when it comes to, okay, well, why was that uncomfortable? Or where did that mistake happen? And therefore moving past that. There's this kind of, I apologize, and therefore we move on. So there's no learning and no growth from that either, because learning and stuff comes from that uncomfortability part. And so because these microaggressions are also so nuanced, people like me, and I've experienced this, and I still do sometimes, where something is said, not until later do I fully fully recognize what that was or how that made me feel, but I feel as though time has passed. And so it's no longer an option for me to bring that up or to discuss that. And so it's also me not showing up or me not speaking out about certain things, and so not giving that person an opportunity to grow or not feeling comfortable enough to bring it up. And that's some of the differences that I see when it comes to America. It's very overt. And not to say that in Canada, people don't die for who they are. And I'll touch on this a little later. That's not true at all. And even when we think about Winnipeg, there are Black men being killed in Winnipeg. And so when we think about Canada as a whole, I think it's also good at political apologies and good at, I was taking a sociology course in terms of the way that it presents itself and the way the rest of the world sees Canada as well. I think the entire world knows the United States for who they are. I don't think they've ever hid who they are. I don't think they've ever hid their kind of racist history, their roots or ancestry. But Canada, I think, has always been very good at hiding that. And even when we think about the history of Canada and when Canada decided to become a country, that in and of itself erases the past history of the Indigenous peoples and their histories on this land. And that in and of itself is an erasure, and that in and of itself is racist. Like it sets a point where certain things such as residential schools, such as the 60s scoop, things like that don't even come within Canadian history. And so it's easy sometimes, I think, for people to compare the two and say that one's better than the other because it overtly presents itself that way. But when you live in Canada, when you experience day-to-day nuances or day-to-day experiences, you recognize that they're genuinely not so different. Yeah.
So I think, when I was listening, I think, yes, there is the clear overt versus, sort of like more kind of sinister, kind of like, you're welcomed, you can come here, everybody's welcomed, as long as you remember where you are, as long as you remember that this is Canada and it's a Christian country, 2 languages, official languages, right? It's that kind of engagement, right? Versus saying, you come here, you're American, right? Here it's like, well, yeah, we want you to bring yourself and share some of those, as long as it doesn't disrupt the real identity of Canada, right? And so we know what that is. And so it's like, play along, fit in. And I think that's consistent. It's always been very consistent for me. What I wanted to say, what sort of strikes me as being, it's the silence, right? In the US, there is this sort of like overt engagement and kind of engage. And here we are killed in silence and we're smiled at the same time, right? Like, so if you think about the incarceration of the over-representation, over-incarceration of Black people, period, right? It's done with this idea of trying to convince us that, oh, we're not necessarily targeting you, right? That we do know that, our community is coded, is profiled in very particular ways, right? And that's been consistent and that has been constantly, that has remained constant. I think of moments of how we have to prepare our children for particular ways, right? Like in Canada, I have to prepare both my son and my daughter that don't be comfortable with how you're perceived, right? Because 1 minute it could be an exoticization of your Blackness, right? And you are the representation of everything that is cool, that is, that is acceptable about being Black, right? And then just when you're becoming comfortable with that, the real sort of like erasure of your body and unwantedness also materializes, and you never know when that's going to happen. There is no way of preparing yourself for that, and so we're constantly having to do a nuanced kind of education about what it means.
John, for you, the difference between the American and the Canadian lived experiences?
Yeah, well, I think like everyone else on this panel, I don't know, I haven't lived in the United States. I don't have any particular experience having lived there, but of course, as pretty much every other Canadian, we consume a lot of American media, a lot of American entertainment, a lot of American everything. It's just natural. I think everyone's pretty much touched on most of these different points already, but I think to me the main difference is the brazenness of the American experience. Like Americans, if you just kind of take a step back, even absent a whole discussion about Black Lives Matter or anything else, I just get the impression, and Americans I think are generally perceived as being very brazen, abrupt, what you see is what you get type of people. And Canadians, I think, deliberately, it's not just kind of a natural thing for us. I think it's a deliberate social project in Canada, is to always make things calm, always take things down a couple of notches, not make things too hot. We don't like having heated discussions. We don't like having heated political discussions. Even our political discussions, and to the extent they do get heated, they're on topics that by comparison to the Americans, or frankly by comparison to other countries as well, are frankly mundane, right? But that's been, I think, a deliberate social project in Canada. And when you tie that into kind of the lived Black experience, well, one of the things we've done in Canada, I think, deliberately and very effectively, unfortunately, is to touch on what some other people have said, this idea of erasure of Black history. Black people have been in the Canadian territory, or the territory that's now referred to as Canada, for hundreds of years. They've been here for just as long as they were brought to the United States or other parts of the Americas as slaves. We don't learn about that in school, right? I'm 35 years old, kind of getting up there in age. We didn't learn about this, right? We didn't talk about this in school, right? We don't have, I can't, and maybe you can help me out, Justin, maybe you had a different experience, but I don't remember learning a single thing about a single Black Canadian person in my entire life in school. Like, it just never came up, ever.
Not once.
Right? Well, not once, right? We heard all about, things that would go on in the United States. We learned a lot about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, even other things. Marcus Garvey, I heard his name came up earlier. These things came up, but never in the Canadian context. It was never brought up. And what that does, the impact of that kind of approach, that deliberate social erasure of our entire history, is to desensitize us and to desensitize everybody to the real pains that are being suffered by Black people today, right? Because whatever pain that's being suffered by Black people today can be blamed on something else. When a police officer shoots a Black person, well, it wasn't a Black issue. It was a mental health issue. It had nothing to do with his race. He was crazy. He was trying to stab someone. They're always able to come up with all kinds of excuses to kind of erase the fundamentally racial nature sometimes of some of the harms that are being inflicted on us. And so that's, I think it's important to keep in mind and to remember, is that, yes, I'm a Canadian. I love being a Canadian. I'm, frankly proud of being a Canadian. There's a lot of things that I think we can do better of as a country, but these are things that we have to think about. But by the same token, I have to acknowledge, and we should all acknowledge, that the social experiment, the social project in Canada of always trying to cool things down, even though that's something that we're often proud of, it's also something that is very deliberate. And the reason for doing that is to stop the kind of social discussions or difficult conversations that we're going to have to start having, as I said, quite soon, because these are things that are going to continue to affect us for years to come if we don't start taking it seriously.
I'm a member of the LGBT community. I've been very open about that. I am a descendant of Jewish immigrants who escaped the pogroms in Russia. I grew up around Holocaust survivors. So for me, I like to think that I am an ally of anyone who's faced any sort of diversity, any sort of persecution, but I still acknowledge the fact that I am a white male and that there are probably unconscious or conscious biases that have been built into my system that I still need to deconstruct. And I know it's an ongoing process. How does someone become an ally and avoid this tokenism or this misplaced allyship?
I'm going through something really interesting right now because we've switched from being independent contractors to employees. And so the whole structure has really, really, really changed. And it's also created a hierarchy, naturally, between the full-time and part-time teachers. So when the interviews were being conducted, this was pre-COVID, and I applied for a full-time position. I remember as I walked in the door, the new owner of the studio walked out the door I was like, oh, okay, good seeing you. But like right then, like I'm thrown off. I'm like, is it me? Is it because I'm Black? Is it because I'm a woman? Well, clearly you don't have the job already. Like you can't even stay 5 minutes for your interview. All this stuff already going on. And then fast forward to now, being begged to teach because they need a Black representative. Like, how's it gonna look? I had to ask for my image to be taken off their social media entirely because overusing, over tokenizing. I'm like, you have never posted me once before. Like, what is going on? I'm like, stop. This is making me very, very, very uncomfortable. And so I just think asking how you can help is the best way to go about absolutely anything. Now, reaching my own work more into Indigenous communities, but when I went up north, the thing that was very apparent is I don't know a lot. And so I'm really trying to educate myself more. Going into Indigenous communities and realizing that I don't know much, something as small as bringing tobacco to offer the elders, did not do that. That was a real learning lesson for myself. I did go in with the mentality of how can I help, and I made sure not to go with a colonial mentality of this is yoga, it's very, very good for you, right? No, not at all. Is this something you'd be interested in? Do you want to try? I try to be very, very sensitive, but even in that, like I did not do enough. I was speaking with the chief from Cross Lake, and he was mentioning how this one's kind of tough. He really put me on the spot. The Black Lives Matter movement is being used by some white people to really, really silence Indigenous voices. Then he looked me dead in the eyes and he's like, what do you think about that? Knocked me on my butt, but I just did. Welcome. But it really, really made me sit and think. And when we had our march here, 20,000 people showed up. The loudest voices were Indigenous. 1 week later, a march was held for a missing, murdered Indigenous woman. There was a few hundred people. I myself wasn't a part of that march either, so I'm not saying this to shame anybody or to make anybody feel bad, but I remember just being so humbled and feeling that real solidarity, seeing all the Indigenous voices at the rally. And then whether I was teaching or regardless of what happened that night, but for me to miss the vigil for the missing and murdered Indigenous woman, I don't recall her name right now. It's just.
Are you referring to Chantal Moore or Joyce? Okay.
Chantal Moore.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, how can we help? How do we stop that white savior complex and really, really highlight the voices and hold space for the people that need? Like, we have a long way to go.
Anyone else want to jump in on the how to be a good ally, how to acknowledge or take away from tokenism? Devi, do it.
So, you know, I think I think a lot of people have good intentions, but good intentions are also have to be paired with the impact of your intention. Like you have to think about what is the potential impact of what you're doing, and I think, you know, to be evoked, to feel, to empathize with other folks is a good starting point. But I think before you start to offer any kinds of guidance and any of those things, one needs to really stop and think about the historical context of where you're speaking, right? And then to think, what does that reinscribe, right? What does that re-prescribe? And I think those are really difficult things. So to give an example, I was interviewed, actually some Indigenous colleagues, you know, had been asked about Black lives, who then said, look, why don't you speak to Devi? And I was asking for other folks, but then I ended up doing that. But one of the interesting things, I spoke about how systemic racism was embedded within our education system, right? And of course, and in Canada, it is not, when I say systemic racism, it is not the overt kind, it is the silent kind, right? It is racism by omission, right? Like we are not in the curriculum, which was so eloquently, stated by my colleagues. We are not in the curriculum, and folks don't even our children, like they see the name James Douglas, the first governor here, but folks do not equate James Douglas as being a Black man, right? Folks do not equate that the first police force was an all-Black police force in Victoria, that some of the movers and the shakers of the politics of this space were Black. So even when the names are uttered, right, to the imagination of the young Victorian community, they're white, right? And so there's this omission that we were ever here, that we contributed to the building of this society, and that there were tensions about all of that, and that, and that folks would lead us to ask, where are all these folks, right? Like if Victoria had such a vibrant Black community, why are the numbers not reflective of that diversity, right? So it's those kinds of things. But when we bring those kinds of conversations, folks are like, they want to say, oh, how dare you suggest that, our education system or our politics are racist, right? And because they have understood it from their particular lens. So they're not, and they don't want to hear our story in its fullest light. They want to hear it. And I think Asiyah, you were speaking about this. In fact, all of us, sort of touched on this. They want to see it in a particular context, in a particular way that is digestible. That means that they can take particular actions which reaffirm, right, their liberal white agenda and their liberal white standing, right? And we're saying it has to be way more complicated. It can't be about you, right? It has to be more than that. And that you have to make space that is not mediated by your notions of how we should be making that space. And that's a really difficult thing for white Canada to hear, right? So folks even talk about, we'll stand with Indigenous people, but when it really comes down to saying, well, that means we have to really reevaluate how we do governance here, right? And that we have to think when Indigenous people are saying, no, you cannot put a pipeline in our territory, that means, oh, we have to really stop. And also recognize that there's going to be, of course, contestation within those communities because of our approximation to this whiteness and the capital that comes to it and the need to secure and to survive. And so we have to really allow folks, and not to then corrupt those and say, well, look, even the Indigenous people are divided, because that's again us for we are saying and doing those things in order to fulfill our own agenda, rather than to be good allies that are standing in support and saying, we recognize the kinds of mess this colonial structure has created. And now we are going to be really taking from your lead and really critically and offering and proposing questions in ways that really honor all of our relations. And sometimes that means being willing to follow. And I think somebody had said, and I think it may be Asiyah, was saying, part of being a good leader sometimes is knowing when to follow, right? And to still stand back and to say, we're here to support, we can offer resources to allow you to have that conversation, but I don't need to be. And I've seen folks model this really well in some community events, right? Where they've came and they've held the doors. They've said to other folks, right? Like, let's make space, and invited other folks to sit outside and to say, let's center these folks. Let's make space for this conversation to be led and directed by these particular folks. Things that we would want to do for all of our communities, right? When an issue comes up about disability, sometimes we need to allow folks who experience that, and to not only allow and to say, because we've invited somebody in a wheelchair, we've dealt with disabilities, to recognize this diversity, and then to make space for all of that diversity of disability to materialize so folks can have, right? And then to tie that up with, okay, even though we want to talk about how this intersects with race, I might need to keep quiet, right? To make space for folks to really give us a rich understanding of this diversity, and that the kind of context that I come about from understanding disability is going to be limited by my own context only. And I think that's true of all allyship.
Asiyah, go for it, please.
Yeah, that was beautiful, Devi. Thank you so much. And I think it's also the recognition, I think, as Towela mentioned, of the fact that we make mistakes. Simply because I'm Black and therefore I am a marginalized or an underinvested community, it doesn't mean that every time I make a step in bettering a certain community that I am therefore making the right step, or I make the right choices all the time, or just because I'm coming in with good intentions doesn't necessarily mean that I'm having the right action. So it's about all of us, and I literally mean everyone, this constant introspection, this constant look at, am I doing the right thing? Is it coming out with the right actions, the right projects, the right end result? And how could I improve that afterwards? And I think this idea of tokenism, it's the sense of, I've done enough. We have 5 Black boards or 5 Black members in a 20-member team. I have done enough. I've hit my quota for the entirety of this business. Therefore, I do not need to touch it again. And it's that's where tokenism comes from. It's the idea that we have reached the peak of inclusivity, of EDI that we ever could, and therefore there's no much else that we need to do. And if you don't have that constant introspection, if you don't have that constant, okay, but what's next? And what more can I do? Or how else can I show up for these people, or how else can they be manifested within my organization? Then you have instances where we're flung all over social media because we are the only Black person who ever worked for them. And so they're gonna pop our names up and pop our faces up whenever we're a part of an organization, because that's how we outward perceive to be more inclusive. And so that's the idea of allyship. But also, I know I have a lot of white friends, white presenting friends, as well as just white friends. And especially with this movement, a lot of them started reaching out being like, how do I show up for you better? What content do I read? What shows do I watch? What conversations should I be having? What questions do I have? And then I had people coming to me about a month afterwards kind of saying, you know, every single day I've had this conversation. Every single day I've reached out to my organization. Every single day I've done this, and I'm frustrated. I'm angry, and I'm lashing out in this way. And it's a recognition that also, to be an ally, you also genuinely need to take time for yourself. You also need to recognize this is a marathon. You also need to recognize that, yes, you got 10 board members yesterday. Yes, ask your question, but don't expect to find 20 more people tomorrow. You know, it's a growth. And that idea also of this quick, fast transaction, that's also a colonial mindset, that everything has to happen ASAP, that we're on this certain kind of timeline or structure. And as someone who's in kind of the business world, yes, I'm looking for changes and I am looking for it fast, but I'm also looking for it to be done right. And so when I walk into an organization, I don't want to simply be your token hire, because then that puts me in a position to constantly already be fighting a certain narrative within the organization. She was hired because of this. They were hired because of that. And so I'm already coming in having to prove something instead of just coming in based on my own merit. And I think John wanted to speak, so I'll just kind of step back.
But
yeah, no, I think,
yes.
yeah, no, I was very excited about kind of you bringing that up. I think because that's basically my experience, right? My experience. I haven't really talked much about my professional background, but I'm a lawyer. I've been working at a corporate law firm for the last 12 years. And earlier this year, so January 1, I became a partner at our firm, and we're celebrating our 125th anniversary as a firm this year. And I was the first Black partner in our Montreal office in 125 years. So that's not, and I see the applause and I appreciate that, but I don't say that as a matter of boastfulness. I say that really as a matter of like a real serious statement of how long the struggle has been, and how it's still an overwhelming struggle. And so I'm going to go back to the question of allyship, and this is what I try to remind my colleagues and my partners, frankly, my colleagues, the people that I work with. They'll frequently ask me things like, well, what do we do? How can we help? Those are nice things, but then you'll see things, something like, what organizations can we fund? Where can we send our money? Right? It's that transactional thing that you were saying, Asiyah, this idea that, okay, we can just get this done quickly, right? We understand now that there's an issue that we're seeing on the news, that we're witnessing, that we're experiencing. What do we do? Like, what do we learn? What do we read? And what do we do? We just have to pay. We have to get this off our plate right now. Who do we have to hire? We need more of you. We get that you're the only one, but let's go out and get more. And it's just like, but you're not taking the time to sit back, think, listen to what we're saying. Listen not just to what I'm saying as a Black person who lives and breathes corporate Canada. This is what I do for a living. Listen to people who are outside of our milieu. Listen to people who are from completely different backgrounds, who have completely different experiences, and who can really bring something different to your perspective. And that will help shape, I think, where we need to go. That helps shape, I think, good allies, is that open-mindedness, the ability to listen, to absorb, and not just to always try to cut corners or to try to find fast solutions, because that just won't work. It hasn't worked in all these years, and it won't work. Right. So it's the kind of thing that I'm trying to emphasize more and more. And I, you know, as you know, being the only one, like it is a little exhausting. It's lonely when you're around that table. You're the only person bringing up this issue over and over and over on EDI, other matters. Right. For years, I was the only person talking about it. Now others are talking about it, which I'm glad, because it takes some of the burden off of me. But I also want to see it being discussed and being grappled with in a more serious, thoughtful manner than just trying to find the quick solutions, just trying to look at our numbers and saying, okay, we need to get that up, and let's just focus on the number as opposed to focusing on the overall system, as I was saying earlier on in the conversation, that is keeping us out, right? It's not an accident that for 125 years there's only been one, right? That's not a question of statistics. It's not a question of, oh, we were kind of flipping coins and we had all these good people, but there were just no black people. There were plenty of black people. Justin and I went to school with plenty of black people at McGill Law, wonderful, smart people, very, very thoughtful. They existed way before we went to law school. There were plenty of black people at McGill Law going back to the early 1900s. It's just not a question of whether or not they exist, whether or not they were there. It's a question of there were systems that were designed, specifically designed to keep them out. And we need to recognize that.
Yeah, thank you. And is shocking to me that that's still the case. And you guys have been so willing to talk about such personal things for so long now, but I think there's so many questions actually I'd like to continue asking, but there's one more that I think it would be irresponsible if I didn't at least highlight a little bit, and that is the defund the police movement, or moving resources from the police into mental health and other resources, and how disproportionately people from the Black community, from the Indigenous community, and from people of color are affected by police services in Canada. And I was wondering if any of you would like to comment on that.
So when we think about mental health calls and we think about the fact that police are showing up to those, I know quite a lot of people in a lot of circumstances and a lot of socioeconomic bands who are not comfortable with that at all. And when you're in health, when you're under some sort of mental health stress, and I myself suffer from a lot of mental health issues, the last thing you want to feel is threatened, because that heightens you. And so the idea that they are following these calls, that's distribution of money, of funds, of time, of people that does not need to be spent because nobody wants it, or on their side apparently, nor on our side. And so when we're talking about this radical reallocation of funds, it's just genuinely recognizing that there are pockets of our society who have constantly been underinvested, these underinvested communities. And how can we properly show up in this way? And yes, it's frustrating, you know, to have conversations about money, because that's genuinely not all there is. We don't want money thrown at us. Money is not the only solution, but money definitely helps. Money helps a lot. And it's recognition of money also a lot of in this society. And until that changes, right now, money is power. And those who hold that money and those who hold that influence definitely hold that power over certain individuals, institutions, communities, marginalized whatevers. And so without that radical reallocation of funds, I don't feel people are even showing up in the right ways. If you're saying you want change, if you're saying you genuinely want to better these communities, you want to better the lives of these communities, their lifespans, their access to food, their access to proper jobs, their access to childcare for their peoples, then their access to mental health, because mental health in and of itself is such a high expense, and not many people can even access that. When we think about our society, so much of us need access to counselors, to psychiatrists, but it is an expense, and it's almost a luxury in this day and age where it should be a necessity, but it is a luxury. And so the idea that we need to be redistributing and reallocating funds, it's not a new thing, but it definitely is a call. And what I think I genuinely want to make sure that people recognize is that this is happening across the world. It's not just about reallocation within the States. It's not defund the police. While that term itself has come from, let's say, you know, North America and kind of the States in and of itself, it is something that people are calling for because it's necessary across the bands. It's not just a United States narrative or issue. I'm realizing my background is zooming out and forth. I just noticed that. I'm just like, up here. I'm just like, yeah, I'm intense. I'm just like, come at me. This is hilarious. This is, and the background is just very, I hope I haven't like been, I don't know.
Perfect.
Can I just jump in here? Because I wanted to add to what Sister was saying. First, I want to disclose that I have family that work for the police, both immediate family, but also family members that I knew when I was growing up in the orphanage in Zimbabwe, who have now moved to Toronto and are now part of the police force there. So I want to acknowledge that. And I want to also say very clearly that I speak out about and in support about defunding the police. And I've said that, and I've done that quite radically and quite frequently. And for me, and I think Asiyah has really sort of, you know, engaged the topic really well in terms of what we're saying, is that for me as a Black man living in Canada, I've never seen the police as serving me and my interests, right? I have seen them as a threat to me, right? And so I would, you know, if I was having a mental challenge and the police were brought, my experience of police and knowing police does not invite me to think that these are folks who are here to serve and to help me and to protect me. In fact, I see them as a threat coming to put me back in my place. And my place has always been, you are a threat to white society, right? So the racial terms are not used, but in every single space is that I'm marked as a threat, as a danger, right? And I can tell you of how many times I've been stopped by police, of the kinds, whether there were people that looked like me, whether they've represented a system that made me treat me in a very particular way. And so I've never seen them. And, you know, and I also want to be upfront in an effort to try, you know, once I started kind of taking on more of a social justice kind of like leadership position, you know, in the sort of like, you know, early 2000s, I even joined, you know, the Chief Constable's advisory in Vancouver, sorry, to try and advise the police chief of about, you know, how can we better prepare our police in recognition of my kinds of engagement in it. And with all of that, I still stand firmly in the ground that the police need to be defunded, because they have been overprescribed to our communities, and, you know, come in ways that are always harmful. And, you know, they've been trained to see our bodies as a threat, not only to them, but to the society and how people, and so I'm sorry to say, I cannot buy for as Black body, I cannot buy the idea that, you know, the system of the police can just simply be educated in very particular ways. I want to see less of them showing up. They don't need to show up where homeless issues are being debated. You know what I mean? Like, you know, moving people that have been made homeless, because we shouldn't say homelessness, that have been made homeless because of capitalism and all those things. They're not the right people to come in. Where there are mental health issues, they're not the right people to come in. And I would even argue, you know, to a certain extent, that they perpetuate and prescribe the violence, right, that they're sometimes called to address. And so these are things that I'm sort of challenged. And also they take away the capacity of communities to begin to think about radical ways in which we can come up and show up for each other in relational ways, right? Because, you know, immediately, if there is an issue where as a community we could address it, we defer automatically to say, let the police deal with it, right? And I think that takes away our own capacity to build healthy communities and healthy relationships. So I am for that. I'm not saying that police have no positions or roles in society. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that they have been overfunded and they have been called to respond to things where they don't need to be there. And that if we had a radical reevaluation of that whole system and started it from upwards and brought all of our diverse communities to sort of talk about, well, how do we want the police to serve us? I would be for that.
Yeah. Wow. You have, okay, Towela, last word, unless John wants to pipe in too, but you guys have been going for a while. So we'll give the last word to Towela, I think.
Sorry, I don't need the last word.
No
John,
sorries, that's too Canadian.
Okay, so yeah, I completely agree. Just like an example, something that happened at the studio here, there was a Black man and he clearly wasn't in a good mental state. He was doing sun salutations, which is just like a yoga thing. Just imagine yoga poses outside and screaming and like banging against the window and stuff like that. Wanting attention, crying for help. I wasn't at the studio at the time, but the girl that was working called the police and they took him, and whatever happened, they took him home, and someone in our community happens to know him, so they checked on him and stuff like that. But it's those like little microaggressions, and like I had to sit the girl down and be like, what you did was actually very, very dangerous. We do have places like Bear Clan, which is like a patrol that patrols around. They have vehicles, they have access, but we do have those resources. We just never utilize them. And it's just, she right away fell back into calling the cops. I'm like, do you realize you put his life in danger by doing that? What? No. But it's just, it's that constant conversation and that constant, I feel like I need to constantly be educating people. It was exhausting at the beginning, right? But now conserving my energy, so I'm able to conserving my energy, so when something like that happens, I don't go right away to you're being a dumbass. I go to, okay, what you did was wrong. Let's sit down and talk about it. I'll give you the phone number for Bear Clan, so if you ever feel threatened, if you're by yourself, maybe this is a different approach to take, as opposed to just going for the police, because there is so many. I'm sorry if I took too much time, John. I'll stop saying sorry.
No, you were very eloquent. And to all four of you, I just have to say thank you so much. I mean, it's very personal topics. It is hard to discuss your own experiences and put yourselves out there, and to do it with me, that you would trust me enough to have these conversations. It just means so much to me. And Asiyah Robinson, Devi Musina, John Leonard, Towela and Kenda, make sure I get your last name said properly, all four of you, thank you so much. This is just an introductory to some very important conversations that need to continue. I encourage anyone watching this to continue the conversation, to look at the resources in the description below, and thank you for spending your time with all of us today.